It is better for us to embrace short-term discomfort than end up with long-term dysfunction.
As humans, we tend to gravitate so much to, but what if this happens? And what if this goes wrong? But what if it goes right?
And so when you get insight to what was going on for your person or your partner or your boss or whatever, you get their perspective, their side, how they're feeling. You're like, oh, I didn't see it that way.
Don't change the language of difficult conversations and put argument or conflict, right? Because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about difficult conversations. Hey, and welcome to the Living Richly podcast. We're so glad that you've tuned in again this week. We've been having some incredible conversations over the last number of episodes. And again, we're so appreciative of everybody who's a part of the Living Richly Nation. Today, we're going to actually double down on conversations, and we're going to talk about how to have difficult conversations, to master difficult conversations, and why that's important and why it's critical.
It's a light topic.
Right.
It's going to be an easy one. And it's
Super light.
And it's interesting,
Fluffy and light.
You and I for sure, and we were certainly, I would certainly let everybody know, in case you're not aware, all four of us are available, anyone, to come and speak at your event. If you're part of a corporation, company, any one of us could come and do presentation. Probably the number one talk that I am asked to present on is how to have difficult conversations.
Yeah.
It's
I've gotten
something
such great feedback on those
yeah,
presentations.
it is something that people really struggle with.
Yeah.
And we want to be very practical today. We're going to look into kind of some of the things that we have learned along the way around how to do this. But maybe take a step back and let's just talk about why it even matters. Why is it important for us to master difficult conversations? Maybe, Kate, I'll start with you on that.
Sure. I think difficult conversations are hard. Yeah. Hence the difficult conversation.
Right.
But I think they're so important. I know I'm a genius. Thank you.
Whoa, my mind just got blown. They're hard because they're difficult. Are they difficult because they're hard?
If that's the one thing you learned today, thank you for tuning in. Thank you.
And we're done.
Mic drop.
See you next time.
Oh, that's brilliant.
I'll elaborate.
Please do.
Yeah, if you would be quiet,
I'll shut up.
so elaborate.
Why I think they're so important is because it creates vulnerability. And when you're vulnerable, it creates intimacy. And when you have that intimacy, it strengthens the relationship.
Yeah.
And I think we're scared of these difficult conversations. And I think what's important to start with is like difficult conversations aren't always bad conversations. Sometimes it's like you're scared to tell someone that you love them. Like it's not always like I'm mad at you because of this. I think when we're talking about difficult conversations, it's in that context of just a hard conversation, maybe something that feels very emotionally vulnerable.
I'm really glad you elaborated. That's a great
It was more than hard.
More than just hard.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. We talk about mastering it. I don't know if we ever master this stuff, but I do think we can train ourselves over time to become more comfortable being uncomfortable. I think, I know in all the presentations you've done, and I'm going to forget his name already, the author's name, but whether it's at the office or it's at home, it is better for us to embrace short-term discomfort than end up with long-term dysfunction. And I love that because we often are so focused when we're thinking of having that difficult conversation, or we'd rather not have it. The reason we're not having it or are tempted not to have it is we're so fixated on what that's going to cost me. Yeah. What's it going to cost me to find my courage and find my voice and say what I need to say? But what we're not thinking about enough is the price we're paying for silence. When we don't bring those things forward, we're going to pay a cost either way. Is that again, I think paying the price of having the conversation means that there's hope for change, hope for better things. Silence keeps you stuck in your current context.
So that's Peter Bromberg who said that, and you're right. It's such a powerful quote. The notion of and what I appreciate about the language around that is the notion of short term, long term, right? Yeah. So yes, a difficult conversation, short term. Not having a difficult conversation, long term dysfunction. Which one you want? Why is it important?
Well, so I think we spend more time and energy creating scenarios in our head as to what the other person is going to say
That is
and
so
how they're
good.
going to react.
We're already
And
having the conversation.
You're already
but in our
having
head.
you're already writing a book in your head, and you're like, as humans, we tend to gravitate so much to, but what if this happens, and what if this goes wrong with this, but what if it goes right, and what if it just ends up breaking down those barriers and those walls? Because over time, and this is something all of us have learned, but over time, not saying anything, not worrying so much about it coming out perfectly, those bricks that we end up building end up becoming these huge walls that are so hard to tear down when you are ready to learn how to share or have those difficult conversations. So I think if we shifted our energy or learned to shift our energy in that inner critic too, but what if it does go right? And what if it does end up being the best conversation you've ever had? What then?
Love that. I love that. The stories we tell ourselves, right? That we're actually spending already so much emotional, mental energy having these conversations with ourselves instead of having it with the person that we need to have it with. And the reality is the longer we delay having it, the harder it becomes to actually have, because we tell ourselves these stories and it becomes this massive issue in our heads that maybe perhaps isn't even accurate, right?
So you mentioned, and you said, what if it goes, we're always thinking, again, these stories, what if it goes wrong? What if it goes right? Give me an example, a difficult conversation you've had that actually had a positive outcome.
You want to go first? Who's good?
I'll go. I mean, I don't have a specific example. I think there's been a few examples. I'm going to use you and I.
Yeah. Okay.
But
careful how you answer.
I think, and I'm not going to pick one out because there's been a few, but I think what Eric and I have learned is by staying in the difficult conversation and having the difficult conversation, what comes out the other side isn't that hard. Yeah. And so what's so beautiful about that is, let's say we're having a disagreement. I remember once around my kitchen island and we were just not hearing each other, and it wasn't a heated anything. We just weren't hearing each other, and we're both very passionate about what we were talking about. And then I went around the island. So now we're like face to face.
She kicked me off she kicked me off the island.
You're gone. No. But then we talked about it, and because we have such a solid foundation that we agreed to, that we have a safe space where we can have difficult conversations, and that we both trust that it won't harm the relationship, or I know I can say what's really on my mind and we'll talk it out. And I remember that was one of the first times we actually talked, and we heard each other, and we talked it out. And then afterwards I came back around the other side and we sat down.
Put my knives away.
She let me back on the island.
Put the cast iron pan away.
And then
I barely made it out alive with that one.
Barely. And then we just sat and we looked at each other and we're like, fuck, we're really proud of each other that we talked that through versus avoiding it and parking it and not having the conversation. So for me, I don't know. That was maybe an example without an example.
Well, I've got another example, and I'd say gelato. We were in Siena recently on our trip, and we have just finished a week in France. Part of that was my daughter getting married in Antibes, and as wonderful as that is, and it was wonderful. Weddings are stressful, right? Family time like that, it can be stressful, and it's emotionally draining. And so here we are, kind of decompressing now in Italy. The temperature is 40 degrees plus every single day. Like, we're literally, as we're walking around, you're following the shade. Like, where do you want to go? This way, because there's shade. Like, you're literally doing that because it's so hot. And so we stopped for gelato. And anyways, the things unfold, and there was just a big misunderstanding about what was unfolding in that moment. And we ended up, there was some hurt feelings, right? And some misunderstanding. And I know that old Eric, and then it came out, right? Like, we started talking about it on the drive back, actually, or on the walk out of Siena. And then on the drive out, and we started talking about it. And in the past, I would have shut down completely. I would have wanted to avoid that. I would have probably not communicated my own needs in that moment. I would have just said that was my fault. But we both stayed in that discomfort, right? And again, proud of us for doing. We stayed in the discomfort. There was no angry emotion. There were some hurt feelings because of misunderstanding, but we stayed in it and it was almost like, I thought this, and we're able to explain, this is what I was feeling. This is what I was feeling. And then you go through that discomfort and you come out on the other side, you understand each other better, right? And what could have been a real downer for the rest of our time there, or at least the rest of that day, was behind us now. And we've also figured out that wet naps can save a relationship. Make sure you always have
at all
wet
times.
naps.
You need
at all
wet
times
naps.
you need wet naps, especially if you're going to have gelato in 40-degree weather.
We'll spare you the details.
I thought the argument was over the best flavor
That's what I
gelato, but clearly it had something else. But I will always have wet naps with me now.
Yeah,
So,
always
thank you.
have wet naps with you.
All right.
That's
Yeah.
today.
Follow us for
You're
more
gonna-
relationship
that's right. You got
advice.
that one for free,
We're
folks.
going to get into a bunch of the practical things to keep in mind when you are setting up to have a difficult conversation.
Like wet naps.
Just in what you shared,
Yeah.
there's a number of those, right? About timing, when to have, depending on the conversation, right? You need to have a difficult conversation with someone, unless it's in the moment, something like that, where there's hurt feelings. Don't plan to have it when it's 40 degrees out, for example. But we'll get into those practical things.
Right.
Yeah.
Any that you can think of where you've had a difficult conversation and a positive outcome?
We've had a few situations where my
I wasn't thinking with me. Like, you get any examples that don't
no,
include
this
me?
is about me.
I have a
Yeah.
few examples from today.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just some reflections on how we are always in a continued season of growth, right? And we had a situation. I don't even know if you remember this, but so sometimes my right,
Of course I remember it,
right,
honey.
no wet nap for your gelato. But sometimes my old habits shine through, not in the most flattering way. And one thing I'm trying to work on is remember that he's not a mind reader. And so sometimes, and I think females kind of tend to gravitate to this, where we just assume they should know why I'm upset. And he didn't know, which made me even more upset.
We're not that bright.
And so instead of
Oh,
using my big girl words, as Dr. Sherry and I like to call them,
Yeah.
I left. I didn't storm out, but I left really without communicating to him. And I left to go to the gym. And I just said, I'm going to the gym, see you later, and left. And when I came back, the communication unfolded where he was very vocal about how upset he was. And I remember you used the words, you're like, I am pissed off. And I'd never heard him, he wasn't yelling or anything, but we stood in the kitchen and we talked through how hurt both of us was, because I chose not to communicate. He chose not to communicate or take time to understand my feelings around, the situation.
Yeah.
But that's just a reminder that we're always on a continued path of growth and improvement.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's training, isn't it? Like we
it
talk
is.
about, I loved, on the last show, we had Dawn Lachance and we had Matthew Rippeyong. And Matthew at one point made the statement that we were talking about becoming vulnerable, especially as a man. Of course, there's the fear often if you do that, if you haven't been that way, that if you do that, you're going to experience a lot of rejection, a lot of mocking, a lot of like criticism. He says he talked about taking small risks, right? Take a small risk. Don't like go off the deep end. Take a small risk, and over time, you're going to figure out like what's safe, what's not safe, who accepts you, who doesn't. And I think it's the same here. It's like you don't go from picking up the book Crucial Conversations and reading it and going, oh, that's great, and go out there and tomorrow you're doing that shit. No, you're probably incorporating a couple little things, and I think it's more about getting honestly comfortable with the discomfort. I don't know if you ever get truly comfortable, but more comfortable knowing that every time these things just are that way. They're emotionally charged. And again, the more emotional we are, emotions are a great thing, but it's actually, let me change my language. The more anxious we are about that, the more anxious we are, the dumber we get, right? Like we're not at our best. So, but how do we learn how to regulate better? Practice, like practice,
It's so
right?
good. It's so true. And I'm always alarmed when I talk to a couple and they go, "Oh, we never argue." Like,
Yeah.
oh shit,
right? And it's
Not good.
like, maybe you should.
Yeah.
Like, maybe why don't you do some practicing? Practice arguing with you, right? So why
Pick
is that
something.
why are having difficult conversations or how do they lead to a better relationship? For like, why should we actually aim for having difficult conversations from time to time?
Well, I think it promotes growth and trust. Well, it does promote growth and trust, because you can't grow just being stagnant and just pretending everything is
Totally.
fine.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the inner work comes from like when you see a tree growing, you don't see what's going on underneath the soil. And that's really, how we nurture our relationship, is really by embracing that growth and recognizing that that allows people or us or anybody to feel safe in showing up, regardless of how messy it is. You become more and more safe, and more just your ability strengthens to be able to show up authentically and not
100%.
worry so much about how the other person is going to respond.
100%.
Totally.
And I think too, it removes the fuzziness. Like, to go back to what you said about we make up stories. So like in your scenario that you just gave, I don't know what your scenario was, but you're making up a script, and if you don't actually have the conversation and talk it through, that script is still running, and that's still your version of what happened.
Yeah.
It's your version of the truth.
It's your version of the truth. So by having the conversation, it removes the fog. And a lot of the time, what's actually going on is not at all what you thought or what you thought was going on. And so when you get insight to what was going on for your person or your partner or your boss or whatever, you get their perspective, their side, how they're feeling. You're like, oh, I didn't see it that way.
Yeah, totally.
A story is being told.
Yeah,
big time.
Right.
Exactly.
And I often will say this even with clients when they're like, well, I don't know if I want to bring this up with my team. And my response is, a story is already being written.
Yeah.
You can be part of writing it,
Yeah.
or you can just let it be written.
Right.
Which-
the urban legend is already circulating.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally.
Again, whether it's true or not doesn't matter. Perception is reality.
Yeah.
So if I perceive something a certain way, I will interact with that situation as though that is true.
Totally.
Even though it may be completely unfounded or at best incomplete, right? And I've only got
100%.
part of the story, right? We talked also on the last show with our two friends that we need to bring back again, because that was a great conversation. But I said, I was interviewed recently for another podcast, and we were talking about how we spend, I think, most of our 20s, 30s into our 40s even, building this false construct, this false self, right? The supposed life, who we think people want us to be, to fit in and belong, and the rest of it. And then if we have a moment of awakening, because not everyone does, but if we have a moment of awakening, we spend the rest of our lives deconstructing that and building up our authentic self, right? Which is the whole living richly journey, as far as we're concerned. False constructs lead to faulty connections. So if two people are connecting based on false, and let's just assume that that's happening an awful lot, right? That we are attracted to someone, or we're in relationship with someone, or even at work professionally, where I've got an idea of who that person is, they've got an idea of who I am. We're both kind of posturing and even in an innocent way, just trying to make sure that we're good. Well, the connection is based on, let's face it, it's a lie. It's not true. Yeah. So how can the connection ever be healthy long term?
Oh yeah.
Difficult conversations help you cut through that to your point, cut through that fog.
Yeah.
They help you or move past the games that we play, and all of a sudden you're dealing more with the real person, and you're understanding their needs, their wants, their fears, their anxieties, and that's what builds true intimacy. Yeah. I love what we said on the last show. Vulnerability, right? Vulnerability is not just for women, which we've gotten that feedback before. It makes you, as to quote Matthew Ripperyoung, tough as fuck. Yeah. And I think that's true in a relationship as well.
Yeah, it's so good. I love what you said at the beginning as well around this. When we're talking difficult conversations, we're not talking always just negative.
Right.
And I think it's so sometimes, and I certainly hope if you're listening in, watching in on YouTube, don't change the language of difficult conversations and put argument or conflict, right? Because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about difficult conversations. Sometimes there are opportunities for growth. There's all kinds of things. And I remember just recently you and I having a conversation where you had made a comment about your...
Wendy's eyes just got really big. She's like, what the hell is he
doing?
I made a comment about my...
Because you're holding your boobs, dude. Like you're... So
I'm not holding my boobs.
You were kind of caressing them, actually.
I'm touching my chest.
No, you were kind of caressing. It was awkward for all of us.
Now I'm cupping.
For those of you on YouTube, you could put in the comments whether he was caressing his boobs or not. He was caressing his boobs.
Don't do that. We'll get rated on YouTube.
Totally.
But we were having a conversation. You were talking about a situation where, and you were saying, I recognize I've got an issue with this individual, and I need to figure out how to work with them or how to kind of get past that. In the past, my behavior would have been, oh, no, you're good. Like, I would have been and instead what I said was, yeah, you do. Like, yep, absolutely. Let's talk about how that looks.
That's amazing.
But that's a difficult conversation, right?
That's a difficult
conversation in truth, where here is the person I care the deepest about, who I would literally run through a brick wall for, is recognizing I needed some growth in this area. Rather than me just kind of trying to dismiss the growth, I'm jumping in. That's a difficult conversation, and that's what we're talking about. This is why these are so critical and important.
But what a great example of how uncomfortable we are with any amount of discomfort. So Wendy says, "I feel I want to learn how to work with this person." Right. And what's our immediate place? Well, she's feeling uncomfortable.
I gotta fix that.
I'm going to take the pressure off. No, you're good. It's okay. Right. But it takes courage, right, to support and say no, because many times I think maybe in our relationships, we are enabling one another to keep going down perhaps a path that's not going to serve us very well, but we're doing it again to avoid short-term discomfort, but we end up with that dysfunction that we talked about earlier. Right?
So we've spent about 15 minutes here talking about why it's important, what are some of the positive outcomes, how it helps foster relationships. We know that. And I think everyone listening probably is sitting back going, I know that having difficult conversations is a good thing to learn how to do. Why the fuck don't we do it?
Yeah.
Because we're terrified. It's fear. It's all there's so much around it that's just fear of failure, fear of letting your partner down, fear of not getting the promotion, fear of, well, what are they going to think if I actually speak up? It's fear. We're scared. I think at the core, we're just very, very fearful, no matter what it is. And so how many things do we not do out of fear? How many times do we not take that leap because we're scared? How many times do we not tell someone we love them because we're scared of what that might mean? And again, to go back to, when you have those conversations, it creates intimacy. And the truth is, most people are very scared of true intimacy, because what if someone sees me for who I am and they leave me? I think it's
fear. And it's interesting. Years ago, I heard this, never forgot it. Fear is an acronym, stands for false expectations appearing real, right? We are afraid of these worst case scenarios, those stories we make up in our heads. And how often do those worst case scenarios actually manifest? Hardly ever, if ever.
Right.
But we convince ourselves that these consequences are going to take place. These false expectations appear very real, and as a result, we withdraw and we move back, right? Yeah. When we should be engaging and entering the arena.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think?
I think we get really comfortable with settling for good enough. So I'm not going to say anything because this is good enough. Like you think about a broken marriage. Not wanting to say anything because, well, I should be grateful for what I have. I've got a house and my kids and a job, and so my feelings. People tend to dismiss them because, but this is good. Like, I should be grateful for good. And we tend to forget that it's okay to give up good for great. But the only way to do that is to have those difficult conversations.
Right. Yeah. I'm a recovering people pleaser, recovering peacemaker. So for me, difficult conversations were hard on so many different fronts because I'm always looking to please. I'm always looking to make peace. And underneath that for me too was this whole belief, and I've talked about it on the show, that I'm fatally flawed. So I actually deserve, I'm probably the cause of this. This is probably all my fault. I may be pissed at you in this moment, but actually underneath it all, the belief is I'm causing this. If I was a better person, this wouldn't be happening. So it's not about having the conversation. The problem is me.
Yeah.
Now that's well behind me now, and I'm not like that anymore. I'm finding my voice more and more in the relationships that matter to me. Actually, I can say now there's nobody in my life, in my inner circle, that is a taker. And part of that's been very deliberate to say, now that I know who I am, I'm more comfortable with who I am, and I'm still growing on that front. I really don't want anyone in my inner circle where I can't be me.
Yeah.
and I can't find my voice. So I'm finding my voice more and more, but it's taken a lot of training. I still get anxious. I remember that conversation about the gelato, right around the gelato. We're going to call it the gelato incident of Siena.
We're not.
I know we're not, because it was really not that serious, but,
But that sounds cool.
It sounds great. The gelato incident, right? One moment I went really quiet, and I remember you saying, like, I don't know what to do. It's awkward. You're not saying anything. And I said, well, right now I don't know what I feel, and I'm trying to process what's happening, and I'm concerned that if I say something, it's going to come out sideways and make things worse. But even being able to articulate that, and you then giving me the space and understanding, okay, I get that. Like,
that whole, and then I'm like, you're quiet. Like, I just bared my soul and I'm all vulnerable. And you're like, driving my I was just like,
I wasn't do. It was more like, oh, what the fuck? I don't know what to say.
Like, say something.
Yeah. But
Right?
it is. Yeah, they're so good, and I think there's so much. This is gelato. Yeah, it's gonna
Wet naps, people. Wet naps.
Again, there's so many reasons. When I ask the question, because usually when I do this talk and I'll ask the question, these are the things that we hear.
Yeah.
The fear, the just, be settled, just be okay with it. Or I'm being selfish if I don't know how the other person is going to respond. So now there'll be no control. And, even as Canadians, just, be nice and just, accept it and everything like that. And I often, after I hear a few different input, I often go back to biggest reason why we avoid difficult conversations is because we don't even know how to have conversations.
Right.
Yeah.
Let alone difficult conversations. We don't even know how to have a conversation with people. And the reason I know this is because often when people will say, hey, how's things going with Wendy? And, how's married life and everything like that? And I will say, one of the most beautiful things that I get to experience with Wendy is the level of conversations that we have around all kinds of different things, like the depth and the richness of the conversations. And almost without exception, the response I get from people is, man, I wish I had that, or I wish that was my experience, or something like that. And part of me wants to go, then make it happen. What are you waiting for? Like it's not on somebody else to do that. We don't even know how to have a conversation with someone, let alone a difficult.
I love that you said that, because I think it's so true. I think of a work setting, and I think of for me wanting, especially for women going into your boss is male. That's already right there.
Well, it's a huge power dynamic.
Well, it is a power dynamic.
Right.
And then you want to ask for something, or you want to, you're asking for a raise, you want more time off, you want more flexibility, whatever you're asking for in that scenario is like not being equipped. We're not trained. There's nobody coaching me on how to have that conversation.
Yeah.
So to have that conversation, you need help and you need support and you need guidance, because we're not coached. We're not taught how to go in. And I don't, like, when I go in there, I know I'm going to be like defensive, right? Like, I'm going to go in with my armor. I'm going to be like, I deserve it. Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's not necessarily going to get me the outcome I want. But I think it's such a good point, because I don't think we teach it.
No. And I would add, and we talked about the narrative, or the false narrative that we make, that in addition to fear being, I think, one of the leading causes that we don't do it, fear and anxiety, judgment.
For sure.
We make a judgment call on what's going on, and often it's a jumping to conclusion, snap judgment of the situation. I was recently asked after training you were with me at a client conference that we did together, and I was asked the same question in my last seminar for the day, and then it was asked again, very same question in the very next session, which happened to be the big plenary session, like the closing session with everybody present. And the question was basically like, we were talking about how to manage your thought life better, self-regulate your emotions better, because it's key to success. Like, if you're going to struggle in life if your thought life is out of control and undisciplined, and if you can't regulate emotionally, I'm not talking about suppression, I'm talking about regulation, which is very, very different. Anyways, a question was asked, well, how do we do this stuff? What would be your best advice? Something like that. What would be your best advice about how to do this better? And I said, assume that the vast majority of the time, your first impression of what is going on is either incomplete at best, or at worst, incorrect, completely incorrect.
Yeah.
Your first judgment is based out of fear. You're passing judgment on the situation. And now why would I want to enter into a conversation with you when I've already found you guilty? Right. So I think judgment is a big part of that as well.
Okay, let's get really practical for the next, and let's talk about some really key. What can people do as they get ready? And I believe that we're going to just kind of break it into 3 parts: before, during, after. Because I think oftentimes we think about, most people, when they think about having a conversation, difficult conversation, is the conversation, is the during. And yet I think you set yourself up for success in the before and after.
I believe,
in many things. So let's talk about before. What are some practical suggestions that you would give to someone?
Yeah.
What are some things they should do in preparing for or getting ready for having a difficult conversation?
No.
Sorry, that was the wrong answer.
Do not have a difficult conversation when you're shit-faced.
No,
unless it's a little man.
I was going to say have gelato, but I mean,
No.
Just make sure you have wet naps.
Yeah.
So before gelato, wet naps.
Okay.
I think it's get your head straight. So like what I mean by that is your mindset. If you're telling yourself this is the hardest conversation, this is going to be I'm going to be so stressed out, it's difficult. And like I think you really do have to get your mind right. And I think it's like, yeah, okay, this is going to be uncomfortable, but I'm expressing how I feel and I want to hear how this other person's feel. I think if you can just kind of switch gears a little bit on how you go in and not say to yourself, this is a horrible, horrible, hard thing, right? So I think you set yourself up for failure by going in there saying this is going to be so hard.
You go back to your gratitude language, right? Even looking at it that way, that perspective around it, I get to this opportunity. This is an opportunity to repair something versus, oh, this is going to be horrible. I love it.
Yeah. And one thing I'm introducing is this get to framework, which is with get to, because he's acronym guy, so it's rubbed off on me. But if you think about it, G is like in those moments, just say I get to, and G is like I'm grounded. Okay, I'm good. Oh, yeah. E is exhale, take a breath, and then T, transform. Just transform your thought into, and then you've got this get to reframe. And you can do it like that, because I do believe in that foundation of gratitude.
And by the way, the hashtag acronym guy is now trending on TikTok.
Well, you
not.
Clearly wore off on me.
I would worn off on I think so.
Such an influencer,
like you wore off on
right?
me. So many ways. I think a step before even entering a specific conversation, we're talking about preparation. Let's back up and even talk about what guiding principles are you agreeing to together. And this can be done in the workplace. And it's trickier in the workplace, but I think teams need to have guiding principles around how they're going to engage, especially when we don't agree. But I think couples, certainly it's important to say ahead of time, because remember, the more heated you are, the more anxious you are, the more emotional in terms of emotionally unregulated you are, the less you're able to access your thinking brain. You actually become dumber in those moments. And if you don't believe me, think of the last time you lost your cool and think of the things you said and things you did. And afterwards, when you calm down, you're like, what the fuck was that?
Yeah,
like, what was I thinking? Why did I say that? It's because you're not in your right mind in that moment. So when you are in your right mind, outside of any argument, outside of it, say, hey, like, let's have a conversation about how we want to do this together, right? And one of ours is if we get to a point in the conversation where it's just too uncomfortable, or we feel that I feel or you feel that I need to step away for a moment and just reset a little bit. That's okay to do. Agree that timeouts are okay, but not as a avoidance move where you call a timeout, but you don't agree then when are we going to talk again. Like it's a timeout to say, hey, I need 20 minutes. Hey, can we just put a plug in this for now and maybe pick this up again tonight or tomorrow, like soon. But give yourself that permission to, there's going to be some conversations that are really loaded and trigger all kinds of shit in you. We're not machines.
No.
But that's one of the, you have to agree to that ahead of time.
Yeah. And I love with those relationships that are longer relationships, significant relationships, to do that when everything is good, in a good moment, over a glass of wine, over a nice, whatever, be able to sit and then let's map this out. How are we going to, when things are heated or one of us is hurt, map that out while in a good situation, let's have that.
Well, think of emergency response, right? So what happens if there's a flood? What happens if there's a hurricane? What happens if there's an earthquake? They're not creating the plan in the moment while things are happening. No, they're smart. They've done all their work. And so when that shows up, they can fall back not on emotion. They can fall back on what have we agreed to? How is this going to, it doesn't make it completely unemotional.
No.
But it takes some of that energy out of it. So I think those guiding principles can be really helpful.
What would you say is a pre?
Well, I think preparing your environment, and like by that I mean like you don't need to light candles and shit, but like prepare the environment where timing is everything. I could light some candles.
I was going to say that's the first time I've heard you say candles and shit, because like you're like the candle queen.
What, is there music as well?
Well, that's
Wow, wow, wow.
Definitely not. That's not the music that's happening when there's a
break out the gelato. I mean the wet now.
Wait a second. That took on a whole new meaning now.
No. But I mean, timing is everything. So don't be having conversations when, you're tired, you're hungry, you've both just worked a 14-hour day. Being able to make sure that you're in an environment where you're able to cultivate that right environment to then be able to have the conversation at the right time. On the flip side, don't get ready to get ready because we tend to fall into that. Well, I'll have the conversation after this is done, or I'll have the conversation after this is done, but be smart about like, nobody wants to have a conversation when they're exhausted, when they're hungry, they haven't eaten, so I think that's
do those
and
things.
there's a difference
Timing.
between getting ready, right? Like preparing for the conversation, I think is really important. Get clear on what is important for you to say, what matters to you. But be prepared as well, equally prepared to listen deeply to what your partner or the other person, what matters to them. I think oftentimes preparation, what we call preparation, is we actually play through the argument in our mind. I'm going to say this, then they're going to say that, then I'm going to counter with this, and I'm going to sucker punch them here. They're going to fake them out, right? Like we play out this scenario that again is, it's not about mapping out the conversation. Just get clear on what's going on for you, and then be prepared to listen equally to what's going on for them.
We'll get into it as we go into the conversation.
Sorry, I'm jumping ahead.
No, you're right. We're going to talk about even
you're going too slow.
The value of active do we need to have a conversation? Probably. The notion of active listening, I think, is absolutely critical. Let me suggest one more thing that this has absolutely saved me many times, and that is in the preparation of before you have the difficult conversation, is write that shit out. Write it out. There's an old, cliche kind of, until it passes through the lips or the fingertips, it isn't real. The number of times where I'll write out, here's what's bugging me, here's why it's bugging me, here's how I'm feeling, and all this stuff. I write that out, or I even just talk it out loud so I can hear myself saying it, where I go, that is really stupid, or that is really petty, or am I really bothered? Like, I'm really.
It's like when you think it's something's super funny, in your head, and then you say it, and everyone looks at you like, and you go, oh.
So there are times where I'm like, all of a sudden in my brain, I'm creating this whole scenario, and when I write it, and I'm like, I'm gonna talk to whoever, you, Wendy, whatever, and then I write it out, and I go, oh, wait a minute, that's one, either, oh, that's a me issue.
Yeah.
Right? Now that I see it, or just, oh, that's really silly. I'm burning this paper before anybody ever sees that I actually thought about this, right?
There'll be no evidence remaining of that I ever thought that.
It will save you to when you get into it.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, during the conversation, we're starting. We got probably about another 8 minutes here. So during the conversation, what are some of the things that you would suggest that people should be aware of, conscious of, when having a difficult conversation?
Like your body physically. So I'm a big believer, we've talked about this quite a lot on the show, like listen to your body. So when you're having that difficult conversation, if someone says something to you and you feel it, like you are like defensive, you are like, I'm pissed, and it's all rising in your body, just pay attention to it and don't necessarily give it a voice. And so I think that's one thing. And I like, nobody manages this like 100% perfectly. Oh, I'm good. There's anger. Okay, don't talk to anger. I don't mean like, I just mean like, we do that.
You should get close-ups of those.
You guys are you guys are so acting the same. Like,
oh
my God, it's scary.
No, I lost all train.
You were saying that none of us do it perfectly, right?
What?
being aware
I
of
got
your
that. I
your
think-
body,
okay.
being aware of
So
right.
physically, but when you feel the resentment and the anger, it really does. It's like your blood is boiling and you can feel it. And when you feel that, just get present to it and feel it. And when I say literally don't give it a voice, I mean, just don't let the anger speak. And sometimes that means don't speak, don't answer, don't say anything, and to, active listening and sitting and listening. And that can be really hard when you just want to defend or you want to you want to speak to the anger, but just observe it, because what's so cool is once you start to observe it in your body, you'll notice it all over the place. Like when someone cuts you off in traffic, you're like, and you're like, really? Like to your point, I'm going to crumple that up and throw it. You just told that story.
No, she's looking at me.
Oh.
I saw that.
I feel this. I
I feel the look. I'm across the table like
I'm
scream.
Yeah.
Gonna run you over with my Jeep.
Well, we can though. Is the issue?
That's the problem.
Other cars are nothing more than speed bumps. Like,
Totally.
boom, boom.
Me, I'm not gonna drive over you.
I would add to what you said and say like when you said like don't attach feeling to everything or sorry, don't attach so much weight to everything that's being said, especially when it's awkward, because none of us are going to communicate perfectly in those moments. No. And so we may be trying to make a point or communicate what we're going through or experiencing, and it may come out sideways. And if we attach weight to every little thing, and now I'm offended by this, I'm offended by that, or you mean you're attacking me or you're blaming me, like the more we do that, the more difficult it is to sift through and actually get to the truth, right? The waters are getting very murky at that point.
Back to what you said earlier about if you go in already prejudging, then you're just looking for validation for the judgment.
And you're not listening to understand, you're listening for your next opportunity to make your case.
Totally.
And that is not a conversation.
No.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add around, because we talked a lot about emotions and just learning to embrace the emotions and be okay with even those unexpected emotions that might come up that you're not prepared for, but recognizing that, training your mind and your behavior, that going in and recognizing that it will be okay however it comes out, because the right people in your life will be okay with that, and recognizing that frustration is misplaced expectation. So when we start to play the story of, if I say this and they're going to, right, we already have that expectation in our mind. And then when it doesn't happen like that, then we're frustrated because our expectations. So instead of going in with those expectations, learn to be okay with embracing all of the emotions that come with it. But it's hard. I mean, like you said, it's fucking hard. Like we talk like we're experts at it. We're not.
Rob and I are.
Yeah. Of course you are.
You ladies are still catching up.
Are you ready to close up the show?
Yeah.
Because Wendy's ready to walk away.
We need to have a difficult.
No, I'm making popcorn. I'm ready
to have a difficult conversation.
I am a novice
about the future of the podcast.
Oh shit! Okay, I take that back. That was a joke.
It's really funny.
I
Eric.
cannot master. Can you please? We should talk about what to do after. Isn't that where we are now in the podcast?
No. We're right.
You're gonna let me hang. You're just letting me hang.
Yeah.
Well,
and gets very uncomfortable.
And I think around the emotions, one of the things that I would certainly challenge people is when you're in that moment, right? Oftentimes you're making me angry. No one's making you angry. You're choosing anger.
Right.
You may be feeling angry, but it's a choice that we have. And so we have control. One of the things we have control over how we react in any environment. I get that sometimes that's hard to stay in that control, but you do have that ability to choose how you will respond regardless of what the other person is saying to you. Before we move to closing, we mentioned active listening. Active listening is it is like it's the gold star of difficult conversation.
So what is it to you?
So that's what I'm where I'm going is what is active listening? What are some of when we say active listening, what do we mean by that?
I think body language is a big part of it.
Oh, body language is huge.
If you're sitting there, back in your chair, kind of going away from the other person, arms crossed, like what Kate's doing right now. that's communicating very close.
Yeah.
It's not active. That's very defensive, right?
Yeah. And let me jump in on this because it's funny because I use that example. I remember the very first time I did this presentation in a group and I said, body language, I said, doing this represents closed. And there was a couple of women in the room. There's about 25 people in the room and a couple of the women right away did this and they said, no, I'm just cold.
Well,
right?
A lot of women are cold.
Right. And so then I said,
so ladies, get a sweater.
My response to that was, also don't interpret somebody's body language, make a conclusion around it. You can say, I'm feeling by how, I'm getting a sense that you're feeling close or that you're close to what I'm saying. No, I'm just cold. Oh, thank you for that. That's part of active listening is clarifying what you're seeing or what you're hearing. And so I would say asking the clarifying questions is a critical part of active listening. What else is that involved in active listening?
Listening, like hearing and not preparing your response, literally sitting and listening without the script for me, without the script playing on how I'm going to answer this, what I want to say next, what's coming, but just to sit and listen and not have to prepare a response for me. And I think it's really hard for us to listen, period. I think sitting there and really hearing, like in a relationship, your partner, you have to be present, eye contact, listen, hear, not prepare a response. It's very challenging to make that connection for me.
Yeah.
That's a hard one.
Yeah. The eye contact is huge.
But to sit there and actually in it, when you're driving in the Fiat, we're not looking at each other.
Well,
right?
I was driving it.
Right.
I had to drive.
I know, and you had to drive a stick.
I had to drive a stick and a tiny little Fiat.
And I had
another
ice cream
story.
all over my hands because we didn't have a wet nap.
We didn't have wet naps. It's very hard.
Anything you would add?
It's like I'm done with the gelato story.
Shifting on the gelato. The gelato incident.
So body language, we've talked about body language, just how important it is. And I'll go back to just setting the environment. You can't actively listen when in your head you're thinking about what your grocery list is, or that you got to take the laundry out of the washing machine before the mildew sits in, and your phone is on the counter and you can see it kind of highlight and, oh, somebody's texting me. So I think being really conscious of and being okay with saying that, like, I want to sit down and have a conversation with you. Let me just put the laundry and let me turn my phone off and then let's sit down. So we're not doing it on the fly where it feels like it's rushed and not important enough.
And I think anxiety causes us to jump the gun, right?
Yeah.
We're so anxious about having it. We work up the courage to raise the subject. But then we feel a need to jump into it right away and maybe the best thing is to say, I want to have this conversation with you. Is this a good time to have it?
Yes.
And if the other person says, actually, I agree. That's a really important. We do need to talk about that. But right now, can we do this? Right. Now, again, if a person is using that tactic to avoid the conversation altogether, that's different. But if it's just respecting the other person to say, we want to set this conversation up for success. Let's make sure we do everything we can to create an environment where we both feel more comfortable, both feel less distracted, both feel more heard. But I agree with you. The listening piece, was it the old saying, we have one mouth, 2 ears, right? We should listen twice as much as we speak. And I think if we even just followed that guideline in a difficult conversation, would be so much more.
And I think listening is a skill. That is learned. And to your point, because oftentimes what we're doing is, as the person's talking, as we've already said this, we're formulating our response, right? We're coming up with it. And then what we're feeling like is we have to jump in and almost cut someone off because, or else I'm not going to get heard. And it's the skill and the confidence that comes from being able to, and I remember I love sharing the story around this, is being in a networking event and having a conversation with this individual, this guy, and he's asking me some questions and he's listening and I'm responding to him. And then there's a pause. Now, we're not used to the pause.
No.
Right?
So uncomfortable.
So part of it, I kind of like, he's waiting for me to say more, and I almost jump in with more. And this happened a couple of times. And then he said, I probably should explain. I want to be so focused on what you're saying. I apologize. It takes me a second to just kind of think about what I want to ask next.
Interesting.
Right? I joke around when I do a presentation around this, is that, I mean, the guy could have asked me to marry him right then. And I was like, I felt so heard, right? Like I felt like for the first time somebody was listening, right? Because he was truly in tune with you could tell he just genuinely was curious about what I was saying, and he was confident enough to go, well, how would that play out? And but he was not afraid to have that pause, not afraid that somebody would have to jump in. Now he explained it because I kept jumping in. So then he was like, "It's okay, you don't need to jump in."
Yeah.
I'm right. So that's
Interesting.
all right. We got to land the plane, but very quickly.
Yeah.
What about after?
Yeah.
So we know we've had some suggestions during, before, some suggestions during. What are some things that we should do once we've had the difficult conversations over? Is it over?
For me, I think an important skill or an important step that often gets missed is circling back.
You do this great.
Circling back. So this is you've had a difficult conversation. You've said a bunch of things, and hopefully you've heard each other and understood. But sometimes, there's lingering issues. Something needed to get said that didn't get said, or maybe something was misunderstood. But now you're like, we're done. Like we've done so much work. But circling back and just checking in. Are we good? Is there anything else that you need to talk about or say? Was there anything that you didn't quite understand, or maybe I said it in a certain way and you're not sure how to take it? Like the circling back is so important. And this isn't just in personal relationships. I think even in the workplace, if you're a manager, for example, and you've got to give some feedback to an employee about what their performance or whatever, right? Circle back a couple of days later and check in. So
good.
Do you have any questions? Is there anything else I can do? Are we good? Like that is such an important way. There's always going to be remnants where there's some things that instead of periods and exclamation points on the end of the sentence, there's a question mark. And the more question marks we're left with, the more we set ourselves up for resentment, bitterness, potentially, and misunderstanding in the future. So
that's a great one.
That's one I'm working on more and more. So.
Yeah, you do great. I think you do a really good job. Certainly with me, you do that often.
Thank you, brother.
He does it with me too.
Yeah.
Always. Even on a personal level.
Yeah. What about for you guys? What would be advice for after?
I think you just, like, from an individual perspective, just honor and applaud yourself for having the difficult conversation.
Right.
Just love on yourself a little bit for having, the kudos to get out there and have the conversation. Or if someone else brings up a hard conversation, you're not expecting it. Again, just applaud yourself for being able to sit.
Right.
How
often right away we start beating ourselves up.
Totally.
Teller's
100%.
remorse. They call that teller's remorse.
Right.
Yeah.
I love that. It's just celebrate that you did it. Maybe you didn't do it exact 100% the way you want.
Right?
But who cares? I love
but you
that.
did it. Yeah.
I think that pulse check, it kind of ties back to what you were saying, Eric, on circling back, but really asking whoever you have the conversation with, how are you feeling about what we talked about?
Yeah.
And going more on that intrinsic feeling of really connecting with how you feel on an emotional level and how they feel versus, which a lot of people have a tendency to do this, is kind of keeping score on, who won the conversation,
Who won the debate.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's great. Two more that I would add. One is summarize it. Write it out. I'm a big fan of, certainly in a business conversation with an employee or whatever, send out an email. Here's what we discussed. Here's what I heard. Want to make sure.
Well, that's a circle back.
You're right. That is a circle
that.
back. That is a circle back.
Yeah.
And I think it's good to do that even in a personal conversation relationship. I think the other one that is often missed is say thank you. It is amazing to me how many times you have a difficult conversation. It doesn't end the way you wanted it. You didn't get the result. And just saying, you know what? I know we weren't able to agree on this, but I want to thank you for trying. I want to thank you for having the conversation. Sometimes that's all it takes for somebody to say, you know what? Let's give it another shot. Let's see if we can figure this out. And we miss that. So those are some two things that I would certainly put out there as well. At the end of the day, you got to make a choice. You're either going to choose to push through that short-term discomfort, or you're going to embrace the long-term dysfunction. Either way, something's happening.
Both are hard.
If we avoid, both are hard.
One's harder.
Both are hard.
Yeah.
Choose your hard.
Choose your hard.
Ultimately what it is.
Yeah.
Listen, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of this episode. We'd love to hear from you. These are the kind of conversations that are not just the four of us having them. We want you to add some comments. We want you to share this out with your thoughts around these episodes. And so we want to encourage you to do that. Exactly that, is to like it, to share it, add your comments to it. Make sure you check out our website. There's all kinds of great information there. We drop information into the show notes as well. Perhaps we'll even put in we have guiding principles that we use with how we run Rhapsody.
Yep.
We'll maybe put that in the show notes as an example of something you might use to build out some guiding principles for you and the people that are most important in your life. So check that out. You'll also find there a link to our Facebook group, the Living Richly Nation, where you will find a community of people who are supporting one another as we go along this journey. So check that stuff out as well. Again, thank you so much for being a part of this episode. Get out there and live your best life, and we'll see you again next time.